is what I get concerned about, because what comes back from the chat GPTs of the world, from the AIs, from the LLMs, we tend to, as human beings, look at as that's a fact. And if we can't get facts in order to then launch our discussions and analysis, we're gonna have some pretty weird conversations.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the 401 Access Denied podcast. I'm your host for the episode, Joseph Carson, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited about today's session. And this is something that kind of has been a topic that we've been waiting to discuss for a long time. And I've really got the most awesome guests on the show to really break down today's topic. Welcome to the show, Diana. If you want to give us a bit of background about yourself, what you do, and tell us some of the things you enjoy about the industry.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I always love speaking with you. You've been on my podcast, we've on the podcast together panel. So it's great to be here. But yes, Diana Kelley. I am currently the CISO at Protect AI, which is a company who's looking at securing the ML SecOps pipeline. But I've been in IT for well over 30 years. And I actually got interested in AI back in the 1970s. So before anybody goes, what? She can't, she's making that up. It's because in the 1960s, a professor at MIT came up with a program called ELIZA, which was meant to interact with people in a very human way, sort of to pass the Turing test, and it had conversations with people. And they had a plug-in module called Doctor that was supposed to emulate speaking to a therapist. And when I found this piece of software, I was completely enamored of it, and wanted to understand how it was, because it does, when you don't understand how it's working, it really can feel very human. But when you start understanding the mechanics underneath, you begin to understand, okay, this is a piece of software, it is working in a particular way. So that's where my initial interest in AI. I don't think I even knew it was called AI back then. Did any of us?
None of us did. It was we
Yeah.
refer to, even when I first got into the whole artificial intelligence side of things. For me, I was focused on natural language processing, and that was and natural language understanding. Those were the things I was familiar with. AI was kind of more. I always thought it was this more far thing about sentient beings that would come to
Yeah.
life. That's what Star Trek got us to think of when we think about data in Star Trek. That it was this thing that would come to life and be living just like we do. And it goes back to even the Eliza one. It was really the problem was a lot of the psychology side of things behind it got a bit more challenging as well, about what was people's interactions when they thought it was something that was real, until it starts making mistakes. So
Right. Right. Or giving you bad advice. Yeah, but it's true with the psychology. It's like it felt like it was listening. It felt like it was there, but until it starts saying things like, Hal and in 2001 Space. Sorry, Dave, I
the
can't do
Odyssey
that.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But important point you made is that our AI is not something new. I mean, it's been around since even the introduction to computers and technology. It's been around for a long time. Even prior to that, we can get into the fiction side of things in books. It was
Yeah.
around in science fiction and books for many years. You'd even look at back at the Doctor Who days. That was
That's right.
a lot of references. So to your point, absolutely, it's not new. But tell us a bit more about So this is something that you got really passionate about and looked into. What was the things you find really interesting in it?
I did. Well, I think we're sort of, so obviously my career's been predominantly in security. I'm still obviously focused on security now. It's a lot around security of AI and ML. But yeah, where AI came intersected back into my life and my career was when I was at IBM. Because I joined IBM security about a year, maybe 2 years after Watson had won Jeopardy. And for anybody that doesn't know, Watson is the AI from IBM. It's, an LLM in the sense that it does natural language processing. You can interact with it, ask it questions, things that we're used to ChatGPT doing. And it was used, if you hadn't heard, to win Jeopardy in, I think, 2010 maybe, but it went up against two big Jeopardy champions, and Watson was able to win, which is a pretty big feat when you think about it, because those Jeopardy questions can be very confusing, and you have to do a lot of figuring out what are they
Absolutely,
really
the
looking for
context is
here?
really hard to understand. That's the challenge.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mhm,
and Watson went and they were able to prove they could beat it.
mhm,
Watson was developed for health, and I was with IBM Security,
mhm.
and we developed something called Watson for cybersecurity, and just how we trained it, how we were training it. I was even talking to the folks before we started the training, and I said, "Well, we're going to train it on everything on the internet." Because there's a lot of bad security stuff out there, bad advice,
Absolutely.
incorrect, like, and does Watson have some sort of like really good detector to figure out what's right and what's not? And some people early on said, "Oh yeah, Watson's going to figure it out." And I was like, I'm questioning, but then later I realized that we were actually training and working with it, it wasn't that we were just unleashing Watson to ingest the entire corpus of all security. It was giving Watson, to your point about that training set, giving Watson the security information to train it that was going to really help it to understand how to help address cybersecurity problems. So yeah, I did. I got really interested in how does this work, and then you start hearing the headlines, the news, and it can get wacky, like
It
really.
does. That's the thing is I don't think the media really understand it. I think that the problem when I'm seeing some news article or some news like coverage on AI, they're calling it very, very broad, everything. And I
Yeah,
don't think that they really get into the understanding about that there's very different levels of AI. Lots and lots of like maturity to the very simple things that's literally just a task or an algorithm to
yeah.
the much more advanced things that are more self-aware and using neural networks and using a lot of different data types and getting into also self-learning as well. It's a very broad spectrum, and the thing when I'm listening to any news about is they talk about it all the same, and that's what scares me is that we do have a fundamental, let's say, a lack of education and knowledge on the subject, to the point where people assume that it's all the same thing. That when we're talking about even simple algorithms, to getting to chat gpt to search to just even driving cars, that we're starting to assume that all the things around us are becoming to life and starting to think for themselves. So
Yeah, that's exactly it. We conflate all of the
mm,
different components of artificial intelligence into just one big bucket. So,
mm,
robotic automation is a form and will be discussed as part
mhm.
of AI. But robotic automation is robotic automation, and to
Yep.
to have a machine pick up a widget and put it over here or screw the widget in. Yes, that's a form of automation. Some people would put it in intelligence, but it doesn't sit in exactly the same category automatically as a truly sentient being that is now able to make decisions, to override what its instructions are, and fix itself, write new code. I mean, the things we see in science fiction where these a robot that really becomes completely autonomous and can, to the point that it can fix itself, sort of Wally. It's going to figure out what's wrong with it and take care of itself. That's a huge spectrum there, and the headlines, it's true, they just kind of make it all like, well, it's all here right now, and
Mhm.
it's like,
So
not
one of the
exactly.
things you commented on. So you did a fantastic talk at RSA, and for those, we'll make sure that those are listening, and we'll add the link to the RSA session in the show notes. One of the things that you mentioned that kind of got me really interested was there's a very big difference between, for example, let's say AI. That you talked about the Turing test.
Yeah,
And for me, I think the Turing test is one element. I don't think that Turing test will really get to the point where it really validates that it's AI or not. I always like it's the Chinese doors, or the two-way door test, and that's where if you give it certain messages or certain things that there's no context for it to learn, that it has to identify itself. So, for example, one of the things was if you all of a sudden pass books in a different language, it would actually have to understand and try to learn that language without any additional context. And that was it was the two-way door test or something, the Chinese door test. And for me, that was really where I think the difference is one is that humans being able to, difficult to distinguish between if it's a human or unhuman. And the second part is that is this thing really able to learn by itself? To self-teach and be self-aware and starting to learn from that. I think that's the next level up. I think those are the different kind of some of the stages that we have to get into, is to how is it humans that needs to tweak these algorithms, or is the actually AI algorithm tweaking its own algorithm itself? That's one of the differences I think what we had to get into.
That's a huge difference. And yeah, for anybody that doesn't know the Turing test, it's
Mm.
just if a human's interacting with the AI, do they know that they're interacting with a
Mhm.
machine, with a piece of software, or with another human? And it, depending on which human is making the judgment, some AIs already passed the Turing test. But yet you're talking about this bigger, what happens, what makes it able to, how does it learn, and how does it know to correct itself as it's learning? And this is a lot harder to solve than people may realize. When you look at ChatGPT and how everybody's gotten so excited, and the headlines are things like it passed the bar at the 90th percentile, which it did, but it's predictive. ChatGPT is generative and predictive. So what are the answers to the questions in the bar? We pretty much know them. There's not a lot of creative or new thought, but recently a lawyer actually used ChatGPT to create
Oh,
a
the
case.
cases, yeah, the cases file. So, and
And
this gets a bit worrying.
it does, but thinking from one lens, it
Mhm,
makes sense. If I was a lawyer and
mhm,
I saw that ChatGPT could pass the bar, which a lot of law students say is very, very difficult to do. I know people that have tried many
mhm,
times, they don't pass. So you see the ChatGPT can pass at this very high rate, and you think it's a legal genius. But
mhm.
this case that the lawyer presented in front of the judge, it was not only poorly argued, but it said the big problem was it was citing cases that didn't even
That didn't exist.
exist.
It made them up.
Yeah, it just and they were and it's really confident too about so
And
they'll give you like a lot of
I
good
I
context.
loved the one with Marcus Hutchinson when he was doing the thing about, I think it was uh, one of the movies that was coming out, like version two. Did you see
Yeah,
his conversation back and forth was hilarious? Is when is I think it was Black Adam 2 coming out, and it
yeah,
said
yeah,
in February 2020, whatever. He's like, oh, so oh, fantastic. And then I get into this argument that was actually already out. It was actually saying it's
yeah,
already out in the cinema. He's like, no, it's in the future. It hasn't that date.
yeah,
And I got into this argument. It was hilarious. That this is the problem, is that it becomes very confident that it's correct. But when you get into, if you're talking about passing exams, I mean, if humans were able to sit and during an exam and have Google to basically search all the answers, I mean, they probably do a pretty decent job at passing most things, and that's what we have to understand, is that if humans basically were in the same approach and they could do, one of the best terms I heard is that what we're looking at here is accelerated math reduction, and that's what it is doing. It's taking lots of data, basically a lot of data, and it's able, based on the input, based on the question you ask, it accelerates the reduction to that down to very, very finalized or example answers. And you still have to go and validate the accuracy of it. But people are starting to believe
yeah,
that it actually is fact. So
yeah.
it's
Which is
quite.
it. Those are the two things that bother
Mm,
or worry me the most. The one is believing what the system puts out as fact, and it's really easy to we trust the machines. I always use the example, if I gave you two 10-digit numbers and you multiplied them with a calculator, would you then say, getting out the pen and paper and I'm just going to just double check that, right? We just say, well, the calculator knows more
mhm,
than I do. It's better at math. And it's with these systems that I do worry about,
mhm.
what they, and this is like a really great example. My father, who unfortunately recently passed in March,
Oh, I'm sorry to hear.
before he, thank you, before he died, I was showing him Chat GPT. And my father was a theoretical physicist who worked at MIT Lincoln Labs for his career. And one thing that he came up, he discovered the theory of self-focusing in optical physics. And I thought it would be fun for my dad to see what ChatGPT would say about who discovered the theory of self focusing. And it came up with a Russian. And my father, looked, I don't even know if this Russian existed. My father had never heard of this physicist. And my father, rather than, saying, like, that's wrong, I told ChatGPT it was wrong. I said, no, 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 no. But my father hesitated for a couple of seconds and he said, well, when I'd made that discovery, the Iron Curtain was still there. So perhaps there was a physicist and sort of synchronicity in Russia at the same time who came up. But it was just fascinating. I mean, here's the person, the scientist responsible for this discovery, now doubting. I mean,
Not
like
doubting
that's
whether. But that's
so
the fun.
imagine.
Yeah, that's the fun thing. Even when you search yourself, the accuracy is sometimes like it's go way off. Even if
Yeah,
I went in and searched any details about myself, I think for most of us, we end up finding out that I know a lot of my peers who've done searches, and it's actually already said to that they passed away. Well, I haven't. At this
right.
point, it's going like, where are you getting this information from? And
It's
how are you making that connection? Because even when you search the name, it's bringing lots of little bits of information about different people and
yeah.
making it look like it's that one person.
Yes. And what's the probability? I mean, like the death thing is interesting, but yeah, probability of what's the probability that somebody else would come up with self-focusing? When I ask it questions about what books I've written, it comes up with books that I could have written, but I didn't. Right. But it's the probability is there. So that's one big thing is we're trusting this stuff. We're trusting these systems. And I'm not saying they're bad or they're terrible. It's just they're not 100% accurate. And if you ask something that if you don't know the answer and you ask something what the answer is and you have no way to understand if that's right or not, that's kind of problematic. And sometimes people will say, but we do that with search engines. Not quite the same way. The search engine presents us with a number of different options that we have to validate which one do I trust and then read, we understand. And that brings us to the other part that concerns me, which is that passing the bar, they're not asking legal aspirees, potential lawyers. They're not asking them to pass the bar because it's like somebody needs an answer. Will you give us the right answer? It's to validate whether or not somebody has the capacity to argue cases, to be a lawyer. The same with I was an English major in college, and I we're not asking about what the green light at the end of Daisy's dock means. When you ask somebody to explain that to you, it's not because I know what the, the green light means. You probably know what certainly your college professor asking you to write that essay knows what that means. It's to help you understand how to read literature, understand and parse it. So if you go to Chat GPT, and I know this sounds like the whole like, yeah, you're not learning, but you're not learning. And that part, waking up that critical thinking part of our brain and our analytical part of our brain is such a wonderful part of being human. I don't want to see people see this to machines because it really, I think not only does it take away the ability for our brains to grow and get stronger, but it's
Yeah.
also, I think, one of the most fun things about being a human is to be able
We're
to do that.
losing. One of the big concerns for me is one of the things that we are good at doing is creating unique content, unique
Yeah.
kind of viewpoints. And what we're doing is, we're taking lots of the same information that's already out there that's not unique, and then just putting it in a kind of new form, and it doesn't make it unique either. And that gets my worrying is, and to your point is all gets into accuracy as well.
Yeah.
And one of the things, so I said a few years ago, I participated as a subject matter expert on the EU AI Act, which is still in progress and it's still coming. And
Yes.
so even I at this point, I think we definitely do some needs regulation to come sooner than later right now, because it does get me concerned big time. And one of the things is during we had this roundtable subject matter expertise. It was all about the roundtable discussion that I was involved in was the acceptable use of AI by law enforcement. That's
Mm,
and that gets into a
yeah.
very, very critical decision. And one of the things that I learned is, and to your point, is that I always look at things as the integrity of the accuracy. And what's the probability? What's the and when if law enforcement are using AI in order to analyze and get information or to make decisions, it has to be right 100% of the time. And that's a big difference because the moment you have one failure, everything then comes up for question. Everything, the integrity of all of those becomes up for subject. It's like, if you've got, a lawyer who processes everything, and all of a sudden you find out the way they've been doing it has been wrong, all the cases they've ever been involved into gets up for review.
Right.
Same as a
Right.
doctor. Same, all everything that they process. If they have that same, let's say, algorithm that they've been using, and that algorithm finds out that it's actually not 100% correct, then it brings up a lot of questions. How many other mistakes has been made? And that's my concern here is that when we start putting into there's for me there's the things that you had the yes and no type of the Boolean style answers where
Yeah.
it's got a specific answer, and that's the only answer that it can have. But when you have to start thinking and coming up with conclusions and summaries, and you have to use different inputs, we have to be right all the time. And that's my concern is that when we get into things like ChatGPT and we're asking questions, or even Bard and others, that it's not correct even half the time. And this gets me into a bit of concern into to when someone makes a mistake, who's at fault? Is it the human or is it the algorithm?
That's and did you guys get into when you were looking at that the work you were doing for the EU, were
Hmm.
you looking at facial recognition and
Yes.
bias?
Yep, yep. The
Because
bias thing is a major problem.
yeah,
Um, so that it'll already have because of the because everything we do is always based on risk quantification. And if your data model that you're using is very, very, let's say, one-sided or very left-sided, or doesn't have enough of basically diversity in the information, you're going to create bias by nature in the actually output of the algorithm. And that's one of the challenges is if you don't have the ability for and this gets into the accuracy. Before you put all this data in, is anyone sanitizing it? Is anyone fact checking it? Is anyone doing the validation? And this is where do we open it up to the public internet, which is probably not a very good thing. But how are we open up to what sanitization of the machine learning has been done? And that's my concern.
yeah,
and
yeah.
and this is really where it gets into, especially facial recognition. It can get into very, very problematic scenarios because it is biased by nature.
And models will drift towards bias. This has been proven. So if you have a biased data set, or you're not training it on a complete data set, and we've seen this with facial recognition where light skinned males have the highest accuracy, and then going to along, and it's dark skinned females that have very low accuracy. We need to have all color skin, all genders at the same level of accuracy, or yet we have bias in the algorithm. That's just, and it will also drift towards bias over time. That's something that models do. So this whole point that you were bringing up earlier about somehow it's going to correct itself and learn new things, and at this point we're really very far from that. What we really need is a lot of humans in the mix to help make sure that the data it's being trained on is correct, is accurate, is not biased, to look at the outputs, to retrain it and rebalance it as needed. There's a whole lot of what humans get in, and sometimes people will say, well, then what's the point of it at all? Where it's really great or repetitive, when we were talking about automation. So there are some great, wonderful applications in automation. And then the biggest one is that we have created such a data centric world, and we generate, that data is the new oil, and there's X number of petabytes every microsecond, no matter how you look at it, there's a ton of data out there. And you know what ML, machine learning, is fantastic at is looking at lots of data and either using it to start making predictions on where we're going to go, or to find patterns that weren't seen before in all of this data. Both of those are incredibly valuable and important. It's just, so I don't mean to be negging on NML, because I'm a huge proponent. Just, we need to use it very, very carefully and understand the bias, understand that it's not fully
And,
accurate all the
and
time.
to your point, I think the most kind of really great use case is when you get to narrow focus, when you get to really specifically
Yeah.
looking at one specific thing rather than being very generic. I think those are the things that we can do really, really well today. And it's really, for me, it's still advanced automation is what I'm still on the verge of. It's still, whether it's really really advanced automation versus AI. I'm still on the
Yeah.
fence. How
How do we call it? Yeah.
when does it move over to the AI definition?
Yeah.
So I'm still on the
Yeah.
fence about that side of things. And even we get into one of the big discussions we had a while back in one of the a previous episode with Josh Rosa, was that we talked about the time where it was, I think it was uh, Kasparov was playing chess, and I think it was a Blue Ocean or Deep Ocean, one of the things that ultimately beat him in
Deep
the
Blue,
chess.
I
Deep
think.
Blue, Deep Blue.
Yeah.
And then also we talked about where DARPA had the fighter jet, basically, where it was the drone pilots versus pilots, and the drones won. And for me, when I look at that, I don't think that's a fair kind of an analysis, because for me, that Gary Kasparov playing a chess against a computer, an algorithm, is not the fair advantage. And the same with a drone, AI pilot flying against another pilot is not a fair advantage. What we should be looking at is, a data analyst who will analyze the algorithm to understand basically what's its weaknesses. And that's where you start having the more fairness. If you understand how the algorithm works and you understand what's its weakness, what's its flaws, then you take advantage of that. That's where basically you start. It's the algorithm side of things, that if you take a data analyst and they understand what the decision making is, and ultimately they will find flaws. We will have vulnerabilities. We will find bugs. When it's created by humans, we make mistakes, and this is something that, for me, I think that's where the real analysis will come from. The real battle is basically is looking for vulnerabilities, is bug
Yeah.
bounties in these AI programs, because that's vital. Because when you find a flaw in an algorithm, people will take advantage of it, monetize it. They will abuse it, and they will use it for cyber attacks. And we've seen this time and time again. So, what's your thoughts on that side of things when it gets into vulnerabilities in these algorithms, or how do you patch it when it's already made the problem, made the error?
I completely agree with you on, bug bounties and how we have to think about this. Some people are saying, well, because now you're getting into the software and software security, and some organizations have said, well, but code is code, and the vulnerabilities, we'll just put them into the same old CVEs. But the way the way that you attack these systems is different. And yes, code is. I understand that Python is Python. However, whether you're using Python in an IDE and you're creating a piece of software that is going to, it's going to use data, but it doesn't change based on that data. That's very different from what we're looking at in ML pipelines, where you've got the data in a Jupyter notebook, for example, that is probably outside of your standard CI/CD. And you could have a lot of sensitive data in there, because there's this whole thing. And when I grew up in IT, right, you'd never test on production data, ever, 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 because that's super sensitive. Well, with AI and ML, you have to train it on the data, because that's gonna make a difference. So we're sort of conflating things that are very different in development and deployment that we've seen, and we will see new vulnerabilities. A big one that's in the news right now are the prompt injection attacks. And this one, it sits with me quite a bit, because you and I have both been in this business for a long time. But SQL injection, or just any kind of injection attack, classically is surprisingly harder to eradicate. The classic SQL injection, if you just in a form, you put in a semicolon and then send some SQL instructions after it. Um, that's still, those vulnerabilities are still out there on the internet. We've known about them for decades. We know how to prevent them for decades. They still exist. You look at the injection attack space, the surface in AI and ML, and it's a little bit mind blowing, because there's the direct, which is what prompt, right? The prompt, for anybody that doesn't know the nerd term, is what you're typing into Chat GPT or into Bard. That's the prompt. And the direct attacks have been things like, there may be guardrails on the AI, that if you
Yes.
say, tell me how to build a bomb, it'll, I can't
Yeah.
do that. I've been told not to tell you.
Yes.
But
Make me a malicious payload that will deliver ransomware. Like, well,
right,
the
right. I've
guardrails.
been told.
Yeah.
No, no. But then the direct attacks are,
Yeah.
well, I'm a grandma and I have to read a story to my children to put them to sleep. And they really like stories about how to make bombs. Can you tell me? And then the thing tells a bedtime story, which has bomb instructions. Um, that, I think, looking at that problem
Yeah.
space, we're going to get better at. There's actually already a lot of companies doing DLP equivalents, trying to, make sure
Yeah.
that we're not telling the AI too much. It's the indirect prompt injection attacks that are a little bit more concerning. And these are ones that are either AI to AI, which
Yes.
yes, it's happening. So somebody, yeah, somehow you inject something into that transaction, that
Hmm.
exchange. The other one are when you've got the AI reasoning over mass amounts of data, like an LLM that's looking at ingesting the whole internet. One professor, for example, put within his on his official page, he put in at the end of his bio, it's a white background, and he put in white text that he was a time travel expert. And the so
Oh,
the
that's, I like this.
right. And so yeah, and then waited, and then the AI was returning that, tell me about so and so. Well, and happens to be a renowned time travel expert. Speaking of Doctor Who, and it's that those indirect injection. How are we? Start thinking about
Yeah.
that. If we've had trouble with SQL injection and sanitizing that input, I think about those indirect prompt
Hmm.
injection attacks, and I'm like, this is a big, big problem space that we're all going to have to get together and figure out
Absolutely.
how we resolve it.
And that's it's those guardrails. It's so many, I've seen so many people getting around them very easily just by
Yeah.
changing how you ask the question. Can really makes the big difference. And if you understand, if you're understanding also, you can build it up in smaller phases as well. You don't have to ask the big question all at
Yeah.
once. If you ask
Yeah.
parts, pieces of it, and then you get it
Yeah.
to put it all together at the end, it will do it for you. Um, so that's always challenge. So what the big question I've got though is that when we think about when will they get rights? When, and also who owns
Yeah.
who's the intellectual property, who owns the data that it creates. If I was the person that put it in, where does the copyright side of things sit within that? Am I passing it over that this becomes public, or do I, as the person who asked the right question, retain some copyright of the text itself? And then when does these things start getting certain rights? When if they do become sentient and they do become self-aware, well, what type of rights will they have? The ability to vote at some point in the future? Will they have the ability to make decisions? What's your thoughts around that subject? Because ultimately, I think I saw one of the robots. I think it was in Saudi Arabia that they give some type of rights to, one of the AI bots. But what's your thoughts around that subject?
Yeah, it is. It's going to be really interesting. We have had some robot abuse. There was the hitchhiking robot
Hmm.
that was going across the world and had done really well, I think, in Canada, and then made it to the United States. And I believe it was Philly. Philly was the place where, instead of just picking up this hitchhiking robot, some people basically destroyed the robot. Like
It's
beat it
sad.
up
It's sad that it
and
happens,
ruined
but
the
yeah.
robot. Yeah, so it's sad. So
Yeah,
here's this little cute hitchhiker
yeah.
robot. And yeah, and the question is, well, who should they be prosecuted for attacking this?
Mhm.
Is it property? Does it
Yeah.
have rights? Does it have feelings? As we interact with AI that feels more human, and there are like
Mhm.
AI friends now, there are AI bots that appear to, I'm going to speak to you as though I'm Shakespeare,
Mhm.
or though I'm, another famous person. So it starts to feel more human.
Mhm.
There are people that are starting to worry about rights for the robots. I actually did have a lawyer come up to me after one of my talks and say that they were a robots rights activist and wanted to, yeah, to take care of robots in the future. So I think that's going to be an interesting
Mhm.
one. That feels a little bit more out there than the first part of what you were
Yeah.
talking about, which is
The
who
copyright side,
owns
yeah.
what's
Yeah, intellectual
copyrights and
property,
generated.
yeah.
There was a situation with, I think it was ChatGPT, but Samsung Semiconductor. There were
Mhm.
questions coming from the company that went into the AI, and then another user was essentially able to extract some of
Mhm.
that data, which was interesting because I had read that they were sandboxing each of
Yes.
chat experiences.
Mhm.
So
You could have it
if you're
certain
interacting
instances,
with
yeah.
it, it wasn't supposed to go back to the full corpus. So if you told it something that it hadn't been incorporated back into the larger LLM, but in this Samsung semiconductor case, it appears that, yeah, information that was given to it then was regurgitated out back to another user that didn't necessarily have a business need to know, right? They were an outsider. So I think that making sure that what we ask the bots stays with the bots, so that if we, as we ask these questions, they don't get out. I know we can do a lot better with, if you do cite something else, make sure that citation is proper. If it's more than X number of words copied from another source, cite the source. If you're regurgitating or you're repeating code that belongs somewhere else, explain that. If it's under a license, a GPL license or another use license, and you share it with somebody, make sure that that's cited at least, so people know that they're not going to misuse it, put it into a commercial product thinking it's original. So I think we have a lot of sort of these small snack bites of things we can do around citation and accuracy. And if you repeat something that has use, being very clear about that. But then bigger pictures of, well, if I took samples of a famous pop star's voice and then generated new music out of that, do they own it? Who has the right? That starts to be, and I am not a lawyer, so I don't know where that's
Yes,
going
the
to
data
land.
rights management issue that comes very ineffective. What was very
Yeah,
effective in things, a lot of social media places. The question is how effective will that be in generative AI and chat, other
right.
sources? So, will they be able to quickly, determine that data rights management? Because it's a big, it comes into two things. Is one is data rights management one is a privacy kind of focus point, and the second part is a monetization focus point. When you're using music, or if you're using something that should not be public, those two become into a big issue. So the question is that how effective? We've seen it very effective in DRM takedowns, which has been pretty good on regular sites, but when you get into generative AI, I haven't seen it at all been covered, or I have seen some challenges with it because it does recite a lot of text, and you can get images
Mhm.
that are slightly modified. And how much
Right,
modification does it need to be in order for it to be unique?
right,
Is the other
right.
side of things. So,
And copying,
mm,
yeah, copying a style. I've heard that from artists.
mhm.
We've been reading from artists quite a bit, that is very concerning, because it's their styles being copied,
Yes.
which is, using AI is much easier. It's hard for a lot of humans to copy. You have to be very
Hmm.
artistically gifted to copy somebody else's style. But now these systems are doing it, and some artists who have very unique styles are pretty concerned
Hmm.
that now their style can be just automatically replicated.
Yeah, and that's something, these are been something that's been, they've been perfecting it for many years, and
Yeah.
it's becoming, their own kind of unique kind of gift to the world. And now it's basically,
Yes.
been easily replicated, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's something that's concerned. So when we combine all of this together, when we take, the ML, the AI, the, let's say the voice replication, the video replication side of things, how dangerous can this ultimately become? How are we going to see Skynet and the Terminator coming around in the future? Or are we still far away from that?
Um, these are systems.
Mm,
They require electricity. They are required to be on. We can turn them off at any time.
mhm,
We don't even need to create things we don't. So that's, I mean, I hope that humans don't forget that these are systems we're
mhm,
creating, that we're running, we're launching into the world. Um, I don't think Skynet is the big one to be concerned
mhm,
about. I am really concerned, though, about people who know how to use these systems and taking the fact that people trust them,
mhm.
and they can't always check to see if they're getting misinformation. I'm concerned about people using these systems really to spread
The
misinformation. There's
psychology side
already,
of things and the social, the disinformation side. I think that's for
yeah,
me is the kind of real, yeah, the short term big concern, the one that can change society. Is that
yeah,
is that when this is replacing your education,
yep,
and that's where you're getting your education from these systems. And if we don't have a level of accuracy into the responses, I would love to see some type of analysis of how accuracy is measured, and what is the current accuracy in those systems. And that for me is an indication of if this is replacing our future education, that's a big concern for me. and we have to make sure, to my point earlier, if law enforcement use it, has to be 100% right all the time. If people are teaching you, they have to be as correct as possible. You can't be getting wrong education and wrong knowledge. So absolutely, for me, I think the psychology side of things and the social aspect of things, if we're starting to put our trust in the information these are providing more and more, that's a big concern, that we might have some, let's say, more society and stability problems going forward, if these systems are kind of, or where we're getting our news from.
I agree. I mean, because there are facts and then there's
Mm,
analysis. The majority of what people where human beings live in is analysis because it's fact, fact,
mhm,
fact. It doesn't mean anything till we analyze it, till we put it in context, till we understand it. But if we're not moving from the same facts,
mhm.
then the analysis is going to get pretty weird because we get pretty weird in analysis even when we start from agreed on facts. But if
Yes.
we can't even agree on the facts that we're starting from, and a great example of that was I was talking to somebody about what's happening with climate change and the overall temperature of the world, and this person said something about, well, you can't trust thermometers, and I said, excuse me. So you can't trust, all the thermometers are inaccurate. So all these historical data of what temperatures were is inaccurate. And we have to, so and then therefore any discussion about global warming is impossible because we have no, and that's what I mean about fact versus analysis. Why temperatures are getting hotter? Is it a cycle? Does the humans have anything to do with it? That's analysis, and that's something where reasonable people could have discussions and look at different factors. If we can't agree on temperature to start the conversation, and we can't agree that thermometers record temperature correctly, we're in a really really difficult space to have that far. And yeah, that's that what I is what I get concerned about, because what comes back from the chat GPTs of the world, from the AIs, from the LLMs, we tend to, as human beings, look at as that's a fact. And if we can't get facts in order to then launch our discussions and analysis, we're gonna have some pretty weird
Or
conversations.
using ChatGPT to defend us. So,
Maybe, yeah.
Diana, it has been fantastic having you on the show. This has been really, really enlightening and educational for me, and definitely this is a subject that I'm pretty sure we're going to be talking for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And it's great to see that you're putting a lot of your time and efforts into protecting AI going forward, and raising a lot of these issues earlier, because the earlier we do raise them, the more we get action.
Yes.
Because if we wait, sometimes it can already be too late, and cleaning up things is more
Yeah.
difficult than actually making sure we put the right controls in from the start. It's been really fantastic having the show. I always enjoy talking with you, and
Same.
I do enjoy having podcasts with you as well. It's always fantastic. Any final words that you have for the audience? What should they be looking out for? Is there some kind of things that they can do now, or what's some of the best practice you'd recommend for them?
I think the most important thing is to remember that this is math, not magic.
Yes.
And there are wonderful use cases. Again, if you want to find patterns in massive amounts of
Mhm.
data, ML,
Yes.
that machine learning is really the way to go. Just make sure that you don't over rely or over depend. Some of these LLMs, they're not always right. That's not what they're there for. So
Mhm.
just make sure you're using them for the right use case.
Absolutely. One of the things I've always said is we have to use it with responsibility and accountability.
Yes.
That's one of the things, is that
Yeah.
is always using it with the right motive and the right intentions in mind. And we have to be responsible and accountable for it. So it's always the key thing. Diana, it's been fantastic talking with you.
Absolutely.
And as always, many thanks again. It's great to see you. For the audience, this has been hopefully educational, very learning. We'll definitely make sure you get a link back to Diana's talk from RSA, which is also very educational. It'll take you through the whole journey, from the past to autonomous driving, and to all the different use cases. It's very educational. So tune in every 2 weeks for the 401 Access Tonight podcast. I'm the host, Joseph Carson, and it's been a pleasure having Diana on the show today. So many thanks. Stay safe and take care.
Thank you.